Hello and welcome to the Week in 60 Minutes, brought to you by SpectatorTV and broadcast on the 25th of January. I'm John Connolly, the Spectator's news editor and your host this week. Coming up on the show, can anything stop the Donald Trump juggernaut? Freddy Gray has been in New Hampshire this week, where the Democratic and Republican primaries have been taking place. Freddy joins me on the show to discuss Joe Biden and Donald Trump's presidential bids. Over in Scotland, the UK COVID inquiry is exposing the way Holyrood operated during the pandemic. In his cover piece, editor Fraser Nelson describes it as being less like government and more like a mafia-style operation. What does that say about the state of Scottish devolution? Fraser joins me on the show with journalist Shona Craven. And what's behind the dangerous rise in ketamine misuse in Britain? Joining me is Max Pemberton, a mental health doctor working for the NHS. We'll be discussing some of the unknown health risks of ketamine and why he's changed his mind on drug liberalisation. We'll also hear from Professor David Nutt, a long-standing researcher and advocate for drug liberalisation, to get his take. And finally, should parents be tracking their children? It seems like everyone is these days, but is our safety-obsessed culture depriving young people of a vital part of growing up? Mary Wakefield and Devorah Heitner join me later. Before we get going, if you enjoy Spectator TV, do subscribe to our YouTube channel. Just click the subscribe button at the bottom of this video and tap the bell icon so you never miss an episode. First up, it was an overwhelming triumph for Donald Trump at the New Hampshire primaries this week, but his runner-up Nikki Haley says she's staying in the race. Short of a Supreme Court block over Trump's criminal investigations, is the Republican bid a done deal? Freddy Gray has been in New Hampshire for the primaries and he joins me now. Freddy, thank you for joining us on Spectator TV from New Hampshire, where Donald Trump has just won the Republican primary this week. I mean, it seems like he's beaten Nikki Haley pretty convincingly. How much now is it looking like he's going to be the presidential candidate for the Republicans?
Well, I think barring legal interventions or possible death, Donald Trump is going to be the Republican nominee. I think that's almost certain now. You can say that with certainty now. Nikki Haley did slightly better than the later polls suggested she would do. There were some polls suggesting she'd be blown out by 20 points or so in the days before the primary yesterday. But in fact, she came just a mere 12 points behind Donald Trump, which the fact that is seen as almost a win for her tells you a lot about Trump's dominance. I mean, he is the Republican Party now. He has been for some time. And the real question is, why did anybody think that they were going to unseat him? I mean, if you look at the crowd attendances between his events and any of his rivals, it's just very obvious that there's still large amount of enthusiasm for Donald Trump, and no other candidate can come close.
Despite that, Freddie, Nikki Haley's not conceded yet. She's going to carry on running. I mean, why do you think that is? What do you think she's hoping for something, or?
Well, she must be hoping for something. I mean, she thinks she can go down to South Carolina and improve her position. I don't see that happening at the moment, because at the moment she's 30 points behind in the polls. South Carolina is a much more conservative state with a much stronger Trump movement. If Haley couldn't win in New Hampshire, it's hard to see how she wins anywhere really in the primary cycle. I mean, one element of concern for Trump or Trump's team will be the fact that in certain counties in New Hampshire last night, Haley outperformed Trump in the general election, that's to say she got more votes in New Hampshire primary than Donald Trump got in the election in certain areas of New Hampshire, which suggests that the Trump animus is still very, very strong, and that could come out a lot in November. In fact, it will obviously come out in November if he's the nominee.
What sort of Trump's view of the race continuing? I mean, is he getting quite frustrated now with Haley that it's not all been stitched up, basically?
There was a lot of talk. I was at the election night watch party with the Trump people in Nashua last night, and there was a lot of this is over talk. You know, the race is done, and you could hear a little bit of frustration in it. At the same time, I can't help thinking at some unconscious level, Donald Trump quite enjoys the pleasure of beating Nikki Haley over and over again. And so at some level, I think he doesn't mind it carrying on. But yes, it makes much more sense for his campaign to wrap it up, to deal with these legal challenges, and to focus on trying to beat Joe Biden in November.
And on Biden, you write in the magazine this week about the Democratic primary in New Hampshire as well, which has been a bit of a sort of a strange setup. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Well, I have to confess here to being guilty of what a few journalists have been guilty of, which is that the main race is so boring and predictable. Donald Trump's going to win, that everybody's looking for something interesting going on. And there is something quite interesting going on the Democratic side, which is this candidate, Dean Phillips, who's a former congressman from Minnesota, who he started his campaign 10 weeks ago. And there's a rather complicated fight, which I'll try and sum up quickly, between the Democratic National Committee, who run the Democratic Party in the Democratic primaries, and New Hampshire. The Democratic National Committee tried to rearrange the primary schedule to make New Hampshire not go first, South Carolina would go first, on grounds of sort of racial diversity, because South Carolina's more racially diverse. New Hampshire said no. The Democratic National Committee said, well, tough luck, your primary won't count. A lot of Democrats are very upset about that. Dean Phillips was one of the candidates who ignored their ban on candidates running, essentially, and put his name forward. In 10 weeks, he's gone from nothing to 20% of the vote here in New Hampshire. Joe Biden still won the primary, should be clear, with people writing in his name. So I don't think Dean Phillips is going to win the nomination. However, I do think, or win the nomination on sort of in a conventional way. However, I do think that Joe Biden is looking increasingly frail. His cognitive decline is becoming increasingly apparent. I think by August, by the time he's out campaigning all the time, it's going to be very difficult for Democrats to say seriously that he's a fully functioning president. In that scenario, particularly with Trump doing so well in the polls for the general, you could quite see a situation where they need to find another candidate. That would obviously be Kamala Harris would be the natural choice, the vice president, but she is extremely unpopular and everyone knows it, more unpopular than Joe Biden. There are other people. Gavin Newsom is a person people talk about a lot. But it could end up being Dean Phillips, who finished second and has this rather sort of appealing backstory, which I describe in the magazine this week.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess there must be lots of Democrats who are kind of looking on with horror at the idea that they might end up with a Biden-Trump race again, and pretty worried about their own candidate by that his support suggests, I guess.
Well, it's not just Democrats. I mean, you look at independents as well, and quite a few Republicans. If you look at the polls, 60% of Americans say they don't want or are unenthusiastic about a Trump-Biden rematch, and yet this is what they're getting. And this speaks to this dysfunction that seems to be happening in American democracy, where they can't seem to select candidates that have anything like majority appeal.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Freddie. Next, the COVID inquiry is now in Edinburgh and has revealed the shocking ways decisions were made north of the border. But does the SNP's conduct reveal something more about devolution in Scotland? Joining me to discuss is Fraser Nelson and Communities Editor at The National, Shona Craven. Fraser and Shona, thank you for joining us on Spectator TV. Fraser, you write the lead story in the magazine this week about the ongoing COVID inquiry in Scotland. And there have been a few interesting revelations this week. So can you start us off by telling us a bit about them?
Well, it was never apparent that the UK COVID inquiry would ever go to Scotland. I mean, we did have Nicola Sturgeon setting up her own inquiry. So I'm not quite sure she expected the kind of forensic force which is now being unleashed in Edinburgh. So it was there for 3 weeks. And we're seeing a rather different COVID inquiry to the one we're used to down here in London. We've had, this pretty bad QC, Hugo Keith, and he has been sort of like me on sound of his voice, not really getting anything interesting. But now there's a new guy, Jamie Dawson, a Scot. He's a KC who's really revealing not just what happened during the COVID during Scotland, but how the Scottish Scottish government works day-to-day basis. Now, the SNP has had various scandals over the years, the ferry scandal, the Alex Salmond scandal, and now the ongoing police investigation into potential fraud and corruption. But this was relatively new. What we didn't realise there was just the extent to which the civil service has been co-opted as part of this. So we saw already the culture of secrecy, of deleted messages, of being rather difficult to find out what was really going on. But we didn't really know that the Scottish Civil Service were playing the same game. So perhaps the most memorable moment came when Ken Thompson, one of the most senior civil servants in Scotland, where he was found to have exchanged various emails telling his colleagues how to avoid FOI, be careful of what you're saying, this might be discoverable in freedom of information, let's see if you can press the clear chat. And he came up with a phrase, perhaps the most memorable phrase, plausible deniability are my middle names. Now, it's pretty bad to hear a special advisor, a junior guy, saying that, let alone the person who's supposed to be assuring standards and probity. Now, down here, you see the civil service kicking off all the time against the government. You know things have got bad when the ministers have to give a ministerial direction. In other words, they have to absolutely override the civil service and they have to write something saying that. In Scotland, this hardly ever happens. That's an indication, according to the Institute of Government, of just how much more compliant really the machine is. The checks and balances that we have in Westminster, perhaps to a fault, don't seem to be happening up in Scotland. And I think the COVID inquiry has shown us the extent of that.
Shona, I mean, you've been following the Scottish inquiry this week. When you take things like the deletion of WhatsApp messages by officials, I mean, it does sort of give the impression, doesn't it, of a sort of croniness between ministers and officials. Do you agree with that?
I think there's a level of informality to these conversations, definitely. And I think some of the messages that have come out obviously will have troubled people. And a lot of the time, just because they maybe seem quite flippant and seem to be kind of joking, laughing emojis, zipped mouth emojis and things like that. But I suppose some people might think if there were some grand conspiracy or real wrongdoing to cover up, then possibly the messages wouldn't have had that tone. And I think if people are working together in very difficult circumstances and over a long period and using an informal channel to communicate, then there could be a degree of informality, of indiscretion, of saying things that you don't want them to be FOIable, not because it would cause, a huge political scandal, but because you're maybe speaking a little bit more informally, or perhaps slagging someone off or making a judgment about someone that ultimately maybe of very little relevance to the COVID inquiry itself and in terms of actual lessons learned about how decisions were made. But of course, the problem of the deletion, the systematic deletion in line with a policy, of course, that's being used as the reason for it. But the question then is, well, why was that policy introduced at that point? And is it compatible with the integrity of an inquiry? But I think that the deletion obviously has dominated the headlines, and hopefully we will get some more information on what emails, if any, were written to capture any discussions that were happening via WhatsApp. Are there gaps in decision making where it's not apparent, where we went from A to B? It could have been a face-to-face conversation that we don't know about. Ultimately, we're never going to know all the conversations that took place. What's important is trying to establish a trail of why this happened, why that happened. And obviously, with regard to some of the more contentious decisions about care homes in particular, about schools, we've seen headlines today about evidence potentially being ignored. Well, there's bound to be examples of somebody saying something and it being ignored, because there were a lot of different stances on a lot of decisions that were made, because that was a really difficult balancing act for politicians. I think it will be in the coming weeks that we really get into more important detail and identify if there are gaps that these WhatsApps could potentially have provided illumination for. But it could be that these WhatsApps are of little relevance. It's just unfortunate that people are always going to wonder now because of this systematic deletion.
Yeah, and I mean, Shona, do you think as well maybe that the SNP have made a rod for their own backs here, in the sense of that they make a lot of hay about how the fact that they're not the same as Westminster, and they place a sort of emphasis on probity and the like, and now they're not sort of meeting their own standard there?
Yeah, I think definitely people have gone back and said, well, hang on, when it was Boris Johnson or Rishi Sunak or whoever doing this, you said this. And I think some people are a bit cynical about some of the use of language, saying messages were not retained rather than saying I deleted them, that sort of passive voice versus an active decision. So yes, definitely when that was going on and when those comments are being made, clearly the people making those comments must have known their position but felt confident in it because, I suppose, of this policy, and say, well, we were just following a policy, we were keeping things secure because, if the devices have fallen into the wrong hands or whatever else. But it does create a bit of a problem. We also have the usual situation with things at Westminster being quite so appalling that you then have this defensiveness from Scottish politicians sometimes to say, well, our leader wasn't compared to an out-of-control shopping trolley and we weren't spiralling from one thing to the next. But of course, that shouldn't be the bar. The bar should be much higher than being significantly better than Boris Johnson. And so I think we will see defensiveness of we weren't as bad as them, but the Scottish public will be looking for them to be an awful lot better than that.
Fraser, it does seem there's been some disingenuousness when it comes to the role of the independence campaign and how that was dealt with when it came to the pandemic. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Because it seems like there's something come out that suggests that the independence was definitely considered whilst the pandemic was going on.
Yeah. Well, Nicola Sturgeon was challenged about this during the pandemic. She was saying, look, are you guys talking about independence? Because at the time, the opinion polls that hadn't really moved after Brexit, not in the way that you'd think, all of a sudden start to show yes to be ahead. Now, we now know, thanks to the inquiry, that the Scottish Cabinet did discuss independence and they did sort of agree that they have a campaign that could be based on Sturgeon's response to COVID. The funny thing is that she went hotfoot from that cabinet meeting to a press conference where she was asked directly about it, and this is what she said.
We're not dealing with politics at the moment with this virus. We're dealing with a virus that we know poses a real risk to health and to life. Frankly, anybody who is trotting out political or constitutional arguments is in the wrong place completely and has found themselves completely lost. This is just about what we need to do from a public health, practical perspective to stop a virus spreading.
So this, of course, makes people think, well, hang on a minute, not only were you discussing independence, but you were flatly and angrily denying that you were in the first place. And this comes to a bigger concern, that the pursuit of independence has become the primary objective of the Scottish Government, and that the civil service, who should be pushing against that, haven't been doing so in the way that you would like. So to me, this is a wider story about simply the concentration of power. And we saw during the Alex Salmond scandal how Holyrood doesn't have enough power, really, to take on and to get to the truth of these matters. And there was, I think, Jason Leach, who was the National Clinical Director, there's an exchange where I think he's talking to Kate Forbes, then Finance Minister, and she's saying, look, what's going on? I need to be told information is power. And he messaged her back saying, look, I have to say that the First Minister and Liz Lloyd, her Chief of Staff, are basically deciding this themselves. That concentration of power isn't good for any country. You need, by the way, it happened in London. I mean, we saw that the cabinet were kept in the dark as well. But when it happens at a systemic level like Scotland, it raises questions of whether the devolution settlement was fundamentally misconstrued, whether the Scottish Parliament lacks teeth to get properly stuck into the government and to challenge it. So that's why I think there's a bigger picture here, that whoever wins the next general election might have to look at Scotland and ask, well, really, 25 years on, is the devolution settlement doing what we want? Are Scots being shortchanged by the fact that whoever has got power, whether it was Scottish Labour, they were acting as a cabal first of all, then the SNP are acting as a cabal. You shouldn't be able to act as a cabal in this small country. There should be, I remember as a reporter in the Scottish Parliament at the time, we genuinely believed we'd set up something as Scots that was going to be better, more transparency, more honesty, more openness. And now we find it's got all the defects of Westminster and a few more thrown in beside.
Shona, do you agree with that? And when it comes to the flaws of devolution and the SNP in particular?
Well, there's an awful lot in there. I mean, I think, sort of some of these buzz phrases, cabal, one-party state, conjure up a certain impression. I think if we go back to the notion of Nicola Sturgeon making these decisions herself, I suppose you maybe have to consider what the general public would think of that and how they were feeling about that at the time. She certainly was the face of the response in Scotland. Of course, she was on television every day. People appreciated the fact that she seemed to be in charge, that she seemed to be making the decisions. Now, obviously, those should be informed. They should be evidence-based, and we will hear more about whether that was felt to be the case. But also the notion of independence being a priority at that time. Well, I mean, the biggest and best argument for independence for an SNP government is to govern well. And so, again, would people think that Nicola Sturgeon and the rest of her party thinking, if we do really well at managing this pandemic, that will help us with the cause of independence? Is that dastardly behaviour, or is that actually just two goals that are aligned? Nobody in Scotland wanted Scotland's response to the pandemic to be fumbled. Even if you were the most committed unionist and wanted to see the SNP fail in the long run, you certainly didn't want to see the Scottish government mess this up in the short term when so much was at stake. So I think that it's a bit of a reach to suggest that this was a big problem okay, so the example of Nicola Sturgeon saying that wasn't something that was being discussed. Well, I mean, in fairness, what would have been helped by her coming out and saying, yes, to be honest, you know, never mind the immediate pandemic, we're thinking about strategy for the future. I think, I don't know, I maybe can't get too exercised if that was a white lie at that particular point. I do think that those two goals were very much in alignment. And I think most people in Scotland believed that Nicola Sturgeon was, the buck stopped with her and she was making these decisions. Of course, when we get into the nitty gritty of who was doing what, who knew what, who understood what, then we may identify more flaws. But I definitely don't agree that Holyrood has all the problems that Westminster has and more. I think anyone who takes the most cursory look at how Westminster politics operates will be aghast that this sort of ridiculous system is still in operation in a supposedly sort of grown-up democratic country. Yes, of course, you don't want this iron rod of discipline and people not being able to dissent and come up with better policy. But I don't think the chaos of Westminster is something we should look at and try to emulate further.
But the problem, if there's not enough debate, you end up with really bad ideas being churned out. As we've seen, take gender self-ID, that idea collapsed. Take the named guardian system, that idea collapsed in the courts. And then you had the idea to abolish juries. Now, what you're seeing here is that when governments come up with bad ideas that are ropey, that would fall to legal challenge, they're supposed to be torn apart by the Parliament. But that isn't happening in Holyrood, therefore they're falling apart after they leave Parliament. So that's the scrutiny. And again, this isn't simply about Nicola Sturgeon thinking her deft handling of the pandemic was going to be an addition for independence. This was about the question of whether she was taking deliberately different strategies to that of England to pursue difference for its own sake. During the inquiry, for example, we heard from another Edinburgh professor, one of her COVID advisors, saying that the politicians he was around in Scotland were very insistent, for example, that Scotland kept lockdown for longer than England, that the differentiation with England was very important, but it was never explained to him what the public health benefits for that would be. In other words, they were looking for difference's sake. We also saw during the inquiry how she was flirting with the idea of zero COVID, and her advisor, Devi Sridhar, was basically advocating this as well. In other words, having a policy in Scotland very, very different to the one in England, and in fact Scotland would be similar to that of New Zealand and Australia. So what we're seeing here is whether decisions are being made, not really because they benefit the people of Scotland, but because they give a dividing line with England, the dividing line with the UK, and whether this consideration has supplanted that of good government in Scotland, which might explain why the education system's in such a mess, which might explain why Police Scotland, this merged massive police force, is so dysfunctional, and it might explain why devolution has not done what people like me thought it would do when we supported it 25 years ago.
I think it's questionable to suggest that these differences for difference's sake were not supported by any evidence, however flawed that might have turned out to be. I mean, the idea that Nicola Sturgeon thought, we'll do things differently to show that we are a different country, and if it goes badly, if it backfires, then we can say, well, it was our own decision that we made. You know, the public aren't going to be impressed by that. The fence sitters, the don't knows on independence aren't going to know. Well, you aren't going to say, oh, well, you know what? It worked out badly and thousands of people died, but at least we went our own way. Yeah, I'm really inspired that we have independence and have all our powers. I just don't see how strategically, I mean, Nicola Sturgeon, you know, as a strategist has been pretty effective, and certainly only really after a resignation have a lot of the bigger criticisms really come to the fore. But I just don't think she would risk making a decision for the decision's sake if she didn't think it was going to have a good outcome for Scotland, because that just doesn't make any logical sense. And some of the things she was pushing, obviously she hoped to influence what would happen across the UK. There was this idea that there could be these cross-nation meetings where, you know, it would be a respectful situation where it wouldn't just be Boris Johnson dictating to everyone, we're going to do this, like it or lump it. And so I think it's credible to push for different approaches to things like UK borders and to advocate for that, while acknowledging that clearly, because of the geography as well as what's devolved and what's reserved, Nicola Sturgeon wasn't going to get her way on all of these things.
Do you think it's been a bit of a disappointment compared to what a lot of us backed devolution thought it could be? I mean, let's set COVID aside, but look at the education system, the way we're plunging down the league tables like that. This was never supposed to be the plan. And I can't work out why, in general, 25 years on, Scots haven't been able to produce better ideas. It's difficult to point to anywhere where we're really better than England than we used to be.
Well, I suppose it depends. If you ask the person in the street, do you think that your life is better? Do you think that things are better under devolution? I'm not sure they would have the same concerns that political journalists would point to. I think in terms of education, obviously we have had the massive disruption of COVID, and with the health service, obviously people also point to before COVID and say, well, hang on, things weren't going in the right direction before as well. But at the end of the day, should we be able to make our own decisions about these things or not? I would agree with you with a lot of the policies that I don't think were a good idea or well conceived. A lot of these with cross-party support, we always have to remember. And I agree that there are huge shortcomings in the scrutiny processes. We don't have a second chamber. As much as the House of Lords gets a lot of stick, it does provide a scrutiny function that we don't have at Holyrood. So I certainly think there's questions to be asked about a second chamber, and I certainly think there's a lot of room for improvement. But when you look at what's going on at Westminster, particularly with education, some of the ideas about education in England, which I just don't think fit with the Scottish mentality. Sometimes I read. Well, I think a lot of the stories you hear from England about academies, about the sort of rigid enforcement of rules and discipline and uniform codes and things like that, to me, it does feel like you're reading about quite a different country. Now, obviously, you look at attainment gaps, you look at inequalities in education, and that's extremely important. But I think culturally, there is a difference there. And I don't think a lot of Scottish people look enviously at what's going on at Westminster and who the UK Education Secretary is and think, oh, that person knows what they're doing. Whether they think that the Scottish Education Secretary is the best person is another question. But I just don't think many people at this point or in the recent past think, oh, if only Westminster was in charge of this, things would be better.
Right, but isn't the whole point about schools, it's the parents who are in charge? If you don't like Catherine Birbalsing's school, you don't have to send your kids there. I mean, to put it mildly, that's not like every school. You're right, she's got a very strict uniform policy, no talking at lunchtime. But nonetheless, she's improved results for her kids faster than any other school in England or Scotland. Now, what I can't work out is why devolution was supposed to mean power from the government to the people. Now, to me, it seems that power has been hoarded in Holyrood. It hasn't been passed down to the parents. And that's why the Academy programme, for example, all that means is parents get a greater choice of who they want to go to or what sort of schools they want their kids to. That choice is not given to Scottish parents, and I can't work out why Scottish parents shouldn't be trusted to make these kinds of decisions, because they'll make different decisions, you bet. Horses for courses, different families. But I've always seen this as the paradox of devolution, that your average Scot has less power, less control over their school, less control over the hospital, or health service, because, ironically, of devolution.
Well, maybe that's just a complete difference in outlook about whether we are citizens or whether we are consumers of services. And I think with health services in particular, do people want to have lots of choices, have that power? Actually, when you're unwell, do you want power, or do you just want to know that where you go will look after you, rather than being given that choice? I mean, a lot of parents, with respect with schools, parents do make choices. They make choices of where to live. They make choices about placing requests, make choices about private school. But a lot of parents, I think, want to know that wherever their children go to school, they will get a good education. They will be socializing with children from all different backgrounds, and they want to feel that they are part of a joint effort in Scotland for everyone to be well educated, not just thinking, well, how can I get a leg up for my particular child? And I think that's the difference between being a citizen and being a consumer of services, where, some people end up winners and some people are losers, and some people have to go to a school that's not as good. I don't think most Scottish people want to see anyone go to a quote unquote bad school or have a bad healthcare experience. We want everyone to have equal opportunities.
If I will accept that Westminster has got a little bit too much challenge, a bit too much chaotism, a bit too much resignations, would you accept that there isn't enough of that in Holyrood? That there is simply not enough debate, there's not enough testing? I mean, here it's there's barely a day passes without somebody calling for the Prime Minister to resign. I get that, that's too much. But the fact that Ash Regan was the first minister to resign in Scotland for 14 years, the fact that there is the Holyrood Committee really doesn't have the teeth to challenge the government, don't you think there could be a little bit more Scot on Scot, action in Holyrood? Because governments need opposition. They need scrutiny, they need an independent civil service, and they need people resigning now and again.
Yeah, well, maybe watch this space. I mean, I think a lot of people think there is quite a lot of internal disagreement within the SNP, quite a lot of rebellions. Let's see how the budget goes, for example. I think the leadership contest surprised a lot of people with just how diverse the party actually is. And I think a lot of people are perhaps keeping their powder dry, waiting to see how this general election campaign goes. I don't think Humza Yousaf is particularly envied as the leader. So I think there could be a lot of room for disagreement, whether that means resignations or whether the people who are in the posts are loyalists to Humza Yousaf to the end. I think we'll need to wait and see. But I think in recent times, you can't say that there hasn't been some pretty healthy and robust debate within the party.
Thank you very much, Shona. Thank you, Fraser. Next, for the magazine this week, NHS psychiatrist Max Pemberton has written about the rise of ketamine misuse in Britain and the lack of awareness surrounding this party drug. Max joins me now to discuss. Max, thank you for joining us on Spectator TV. You write in the magazine this week about the dangers of the drug ketamine. For any viewers who aren't familiar with ketamine, can you give us a brief explanation about what it is and why people are taking it?
Yeah, sure. I mean, actually, it's interesting because it's a relatively new drug, I think, for people to be using. I mean, it's now very, very widespread. It's one of the most common drugs that people under the age of 24 are using. And actually, when I was at university 25 years ago, I'd never even heard of ketamine. So, sort of roughly speaking, or kind of sort of medically speaking, it's what we call a dissociative anaesthetic. But it is used in medicine. It's used in anaesthesia. It helps patients with kind of things like pain management and to get people off into when they're being anaesthetised. And it's also been more experimentally used more recently, fairly recently, probably the last couple of years, in the treatment of depression. But it's classed as a form of anaesthetic, basically. And it was developed back in the 1960s, early 60s. But it was used in combat situations in the Vietnam War, and that was when it was sort of really widespread use within medicine was in the Vietnam War, and then following on from that, it was used more within the anaesthetic area, and really since the 80s, it's been a drug of misuse, we might say, but really kind of 80s and 90s, it was used really by just only hardcore clubbers. So it was within that kind of like really underground sort of scene. Along with things like ecstasy back in the 80s and 90s. And then it seemed to have like a bit of a lull period during the noughties. And then really the last kind of like 10, 15 years, we've really seen it kind of taking off. And certainly I think in the last kind of 5, 6, 7 years, it seems it's really, really, really escalated.
And it seems, Max, that it's particularly dangerous. I mean, you mentioned in your piece, I think the Times said last year, something like 41 students who died had it in their systems. I mean, what makes it dangerous in particular?
I mean, that's a really good question. I think first of all, what's interesting is people's attitudes towards it. It seems to have missed, kind of if you think of heroin, you think of the 1980s and HIV and hepatitis. If you think of ecstasy, you might think of people like Leah Betts. There's kind of lots of big headlines around things like cocaine and things like that. Actually, ketamine has kind of flown below the radar quite a lot. And I think one of its biggest PR coups, if it had a PR company, it'd be winning awards. Is that actually it's managed to? It's still a Class B drug. So actually, while most of the other drugs that we call hardcore drugs are Class A, this is still Class B. And actually, that has kind of come with it. There's that attitude that kind of it's not really that bad. It's Class B. It's not kind of really serious. And so we've so when I speak to patients, a lot of it is around their attitudes of like, well, I'd never do proper hardcore drugs. I just smoke weed and I do ketamine. But actually, we know ketamine is a hugely, hugely dangerous drug. So basically, people take it for this sense of euphoria they get. The problem comes that actually that is only at a very specific low dose. It is an anaesthetic, it's a tranquilizer. It's often called a horse tranquilizer because it's sometimes used in veterinary medicine. And in fact, one of the slang names is donkey dust. Because it's used for to knock out large animals. Now, obviously, if it's knocking out large animals, it also can knock out an 18, 19, 20-year-old. So the problem is that actually dosing it is incredibly difficult. for a number of reasons. It's hard to know exactly what you've taken. People are often taking it with other things as well, so they lose track of when they last took it. And also it's often very frequently cut with other things. So not only do you not know what you're getting, but also the dose that you're taking. You don't know how strong the powder you're taking is. So in higher doses, it then creates this kind of dissociative state where people lose a track of time. They start kind of retreating into themselves. They're unable to communicate with the outside world. It's often a very, very scary experience. It's what they call a K-hole. So people fall into a K-hole. They are often they appear paralyzed. They're awake, but they have no interaction with the outside world. You can't speak to them. They can't communicate. And actually, that moves on to respiratory depression. It increases your heart rate and so on, and then it leads to death. And in fact, Matthew Perry, the Friends actor, actually the autopsy report said that he died from the acute effects of ketamine. And actually, this guy was a seasoned drug user. He was very used to using drugs, and the concern is that actually, even people that seem to know or think they know what they're doing, because of the way that ketamine affects you, because of the factor around the dosing, it's actually almost impossible to take a safe illicit dose.
I see. So there's the danger there, and then you mentioned as well in the piece that there's sort of long-term effects for high dosage users, which sort of concern their bladder. Can you tell us a bit about that too?
Yeah, well, actually, interesting. It's not even necessarily high dose users. So there is a thing, and actually, I've seen this a couple of times in A&E. And I mean, every urologist you speak to will have seen this now. And this is new. This is a relatively new thing. If you go back 15 years, as I say, it was quite an unusual thing to see. Now, particularly people who work in the cities will see it all the time. So it causes a number of problems specifically to the bladder. So of course, there's all of the problems that any drugs can cause around, sort of generally if you take too much. But actually, ketamine directly affects specifically the bladder. And it does a number of things to it. It can cause like an ulcerative kind of condition. So it ulcerates, and it can be absolutely agonizing. So you have these open wounds inside the bladder. So, I mean, I'm not going to go into too much detail, but it's incredibly painful and very, very unpleasant. And actually the tragedy is people often end up taking more ketamine, because don't forget it's an anesthetic. They end up taking more ketamine to try and get over the pain. And actually that just makes the situation worse and worse. It also causes a retraction of your bladder, and it can be really quite serious. It can be the size of a toddler. So it can be massively, massively smaller bladder, which means people are frequently having to go to the toilet. And actually, in some cases, they've had to remove the bladder entirely, and give a false bladder. So I mean, it can be incredibly serious. And actually, the sort of initially it was felt, well, this is quite an idiosyncratic, unique reaction to ketamine. It's an unusual reaction. Probably, it's probably quite rare. And actually, studies have now been shown that it affects about 20% of users. And actually, some studies have shown it's actually up to 90% of users, depending on which kind of particular studies you're looking at. When I sort of talk to patients and even friends about this, because I've got even friends that are using it, and I kind of say, guys, do you not know about the risks? It's an anaesthetic. You could fall into a K-hole. You could die. You could choke on your tongue. List all these things. And I talk about bladder problems. People are just, I had somebody a couple of months ago didn't believe me and had to Google it. And I was like, I've been a doctor for 20 years. I definitely know what I'm talking about. It's just really surprising how, again, in some areas, with some illicit substances, there seems to be so much knowledge. Even alcohol. You say to stop anyone on the street and you say, to ask about alcohol, they say, oh yeah, it damages your liver. You ask about ketamine, users don't seem to know what the potential, how it can affect them.
Max, later on in the show, we're talking to Professor David Nutt, who's talked obviously a lot in the past about legalisation. And I'm guessing his argument will be that if we legalise it, you'll allow people to control the dosage they have. They'll be able to be informed and educated. They won't mix ketamine with alcohol. What do you say to that? Do you think there is a safe way of taking this? Do you see any merit in that?
Yeah, that's very good. I mean, I'm a great fan of actually Professor Nutt. I think he's great. I mean, I would say he is an academic now. He doesn't, as far as I know, doesn't see patients so much, and certainly he doesn't work in drug clinics. But I mean, he's incredibly knowledgeable about the pharmacological side of things. I would say, just to kind of preface everything, is that actually ketamine has been shown to be really interesting in the treatment of depression, in certain types of depression. for people with treatment-resistant depression, it seems to really potentially have been a very innovative, interesting area. And I know that Professor Nutt's very interested in that and is doing research into it. And I wouldn't want to scare people for ketamine. It's very different being given a ketamine infusion in a hospital to snorting it off a key in the toilet in a club. And that's kind of a really important distinction to make. The question around legalization, I'm very wary of decriminalization, because I think actually all we do is we allow the drug dealers basically to then take over, and we just turn a blind eye. It doesn't help us or protect anybody, and it just allows criminality to run rife. I've thought a lot about legalization. When I first started as a doctor, I was quite against it, and I thought actually no, people need protecting. They're not making really informed decisions, because they haven't seen the kind of things that really is going to happen to them. And actually we need to try kind of treat those people still with kindness and compassion, because often they're using illicit substances because of deep emotional problems, but actually we need to make sure that we're protecting them from it. I have to say, I feel now, having worked in drug services for many years and with lots and lots of drug users, and worked in A&E and seen the fallout of drug use over years, I've kind of shifted actually. I kind of feel that we had a decision, we had a choice. We had two things we had to decide: either legalize it or don't legalize it and criminalize it. And actually, we didn't really decide either. We didn't go down the kind of Singapore model, where actually it's incredibly punitive. We crush down on people. We're very strict. And actually, we kind of had like a bit of a halfway house. And I think there's an argument of like, well, we're not going to win the war on drugs because we never really started it, really. When you compare to other countries where they've really, really cracked down. Now, actually, I don't want to live in Saudi Arabia or Singapore, to be honest. So I kind of feel that, well, actually, Professor Nutt has got a really good point. Actually, if we did legalise it, and we said to people, look, there were these risks, and we taxed it, and you could only get it from select kind of, authorised places, that there was some kind of, prohibition, or that there was some kind of legislation in place to make sure that people under a certain age can get access to it, and that there was very strong penalties for people that did supply it to people who were underage and so on, in a sort of similar way, but maybe much more stronger than we do with alcohol and even cigarettes now. Actually, it would enable us to kind of monitor its use. It would ensure that we could have it so that it was in its purest form. It would take it out of the hands of criminals. So I've actually have shifted much more. I think there is an argument for making some drugs still illicit, illegal, and they remain illicit substances. But I certainly think the problem is at the moment we've got alcohol, which is a depressant. We don't really have it. If you want to go out and party and you want an enhanced experience, if you use alcohol, essentially your night's going to end probably quite early. If you want to be out until 6 o'clock in the morning, I don't live very far from a very well-known nightclub, and people are coming out literally at 6, 7, 8 in the morning. There is no way that everyone coming out there has been drinking alcohol all night. They're all on drugs. And if we kind of acknowledge, for whatever reason, there's people that want to do that, we need some kind of stimulant that's legal. So be it ecstasy or ketamine or cocaine or something, we need to kind of understand that there's people are using substances for specific reasons, and actually our legislation at the moment doesn't allow for a whole cohort of people, doesn't allow them to use anything legally. And so they're deciding, I personally think it's an error, but they are deciding to get stuff illegally. So I actually think he has a very persuasive argument. As I say, I feel that there was a decision was made at some point, and we decided not to have a war on drugs, and it's pointless considering that we're kidding ourselves that we did.
Thank you, Max, for joining us on Spectator TV. Before we move on to our final segment, we also caught up with Professor David Nutt, an author and renowned supporter of drug liberalisation. David, thank you for joining us on Spectator TV. Here to talk to us about ketamine today. You've written a lot in the past, you've spoken a lot in the past about sort of the benefits of drug legalisation and things that could come from that. For people who are maybe less familiar with your arguments, could you sort of briefly make that case here?
Well, in essence, I believe people are rational. And if they actually know what they're doing, they're likely to come to less harm than if they do things which they think are safe, with drugs of unclear provenance, certainly of unclear strength and dose, in which case they can often come to harm. So I think a policy where you have a regulated market or at the very least, decriminalization of users and testing so people can find out what they're doing without fear of prosecution. That is the most rational way forward. And it's been proven because the Dutch have been doing that for the last 30 years. And they have very, very, very few deaths from drugs, whereas we have lots of deaths from drugs.
And am I right in saying you believe sort of legalization should be applied to ketamine as well?
When we say legalization, what I mean is that what we should be doing is at the very least decriminalizing possession. I think we should also encourage people to be able to access testing very, very readily so they know what they're taking. But I haven't done enough of an analysis of the realities of a ketamine market. That's something that we've done before with alcohol and tobacco and opiates. I suspect if we did that analysis, it would also come to the same conclusion that some kind of regulated market where people knew what they were getting, where those people who were buying it could be vetted, might even have to have evidence from their doctor that they were mentally well enough to have it, where they could be given safety advice and also been told what to do if things go wrong. I think that kind of approach could well work. I think it's certainly likely to be better than what we have at present.
Max makes the case in his piece that ketamine in particular is quite dangerous in the sense that when it's mixed with alcohol, it's very difficult for your body to regulate. And that's the kind of the danger point, which is that it might be safe maybe some or most of the time, but it can be particularly lethal if you make that judgment wrong in terms of quantities. I mean, do you buy that? I mean, because that seems like something that sort of testing and legalization maybe wouldn't be able to deal with.
No, he's right. Particularly for naive users, it's a huge issue. I mean, I just want to say a couple of things about that. There is no doubt that ketamine is much more dangerous if it's used with other drugs, particularly if it's used with alcohol, because they're both sedatives, and they work interestingly. They're sort of a double whammy on the brain, and together they can produce a state of great intoxication and anesthesia. And sometimes that kills you, and sometimes you just do other strange things, like decide you can swim in a bath underwater, and then you can't. So that seems to be what Perry did. So yes, ketamine use, particularly with other sedatives, is very dangerous. But my argument would be, is it more dangerous than alcohol? Probably not. We know that very few people die of ketamine who aren't using other drugs. So I think if you had it in a situation where there was appropriate education, and people knew it, as I say, the doses they were taking, and were warned not to use it inappropriately, you might well get away, or at least reduce the number of these deaths, like that's the recent student death, where she was clearly drunk. In fact, I have a general message to anyone: don't ever drug and drink. And if you're drunk, don't take other drugs, because you don't know what's in them. I mean, it might be ketamine, it might not be. It might be it's fentanyl or some other even more dangerous substance. So alcohol is a problem because it encourages people to take risks, and it makes them more vulnerable to the effects of the risks they're taking with other drugs.
David, you've talked as well in the past about sort of maybe there are some beneficial uses of ketamine, in particular with regards to mental health and depression. Could you tell us a bit about that?
Well, yeah, I mean, ketamine is a really valuable medicine. It's one of the most important medicines in the world. Half of all the surgery done in sub-Saharan Africa is done on ketamine. Why? Because you don't need doctors to give ketamine. It doesn't cause respiratory depression. You don't need to ventilate people. You don't need anaesthetists. Basically, a trained nurse can do ketamine adequately to provide for surgery. So it's a hugely important medicine. And I just want to emphasize this because the hysteria, particularly generated a few years ago in China about the misuse of ketamine, led the Chinese government to petition the United Nations to ban ketamine globally, to try to stop the misuse in Hong Kong, essentially. And we and also doctors and vets protested this terribly. That would be an utterly ridiculous approach. So banning ketamine in order to reduce the harms for recreational use would be absolutely outrageous, totally disproportionate. So I just want to emphasize that banning has potentially very perverse consequences. And just as an aside, when ketamine was rescheduled, it was once upon a time it was class C, and then it was rescheduled to class B in an attempt to reduce harms, which it didn't. It had a huge negative impact because it used to be being held by paramedics and people at festivals to deal with broken legs, etc. And then they couldn't do that because they had to have a special license to hold ketamine there. So there was a year when it was very, very hard for people to do emergency repairs to people in the field. So banging up the classification penalties usually just has no impact on use and does get in the way of clinical value. So the clinical value I've already mentioned is if through anesthesia worldwide. It's also, for the last 20 years, being developed in low-dose infusions for pain syndromes. So pain anaesthetists and other doctors use it. And in the last 10 years, it's undergone a fascinating resurrection as an antidepressant because it seems to allow people, 1 or 2 doses of ketamine, break down patterns of negative thinking and allow people to escape from really deep treatment-resistant depression. So it's turning out to be an enormously valuable drug in psychiatry as well.
I see. Max makes the argument in his piece, David. I imagine you'll disagree with this, that the sort of studies that show ketamine is beneficial for your mental health, for example, almost act as a bit of a PR for the drug and make it seem more safe to recreational users. Do you think there's anything to that? Or do you think it maybe needs to be made clearer that you're not doing a controlled study, you're taking, a ton of ketamine at the weekend, and it's a different sort of proposition?
Yeah, I mean, the reality is, I don't think the use of ketamine has changed since it became a medicine. I don't think it's a PR. I think the reality is there are a lot of patients, and you can talk to people like Rupert McShane in Oxford, who's been running a ketamine clinic for 10 years and saving lives. So, no, I don't think it's a PR stunt at all. But even if it was encouraging people to use, which I suspect it isn't, the way around that is education. It's not banning it. It's not. I mean, it's just great. These calls make it Class A. Well, I should put my hand up. I was actually chairing the committee that made it a controlled drug in the first place. Before 2004, it wasn't controlled. We spent about 2 years on the ACMD evaluating the harms of ketamine, and we decided, rather grudgingly, we ought to try to give a message of harm by putting it into the Misuse of Drugs Act as a Class C drug. I don't think that had any impact on use whatsoever. And then a few more deaths, and then it was moved to Class B, and now they're moved to Class A. But the reality is, people who use ketamine, they don't actually care what the class is because the users it has almost no impact on, and the people who are selling it. The difference in penalties for a dealer between a Class C drug and a Class A drug are trivial because the government has actually distorted the drug laws so that basically you supposedly attract pretty much the maximum penalty. 14 years for Class B and life for Class A. Well, I mean, very few people get 14 years with a life sentence. So the reality is the penalties are not a dissuasion to people who are dealing it. They have absolutely zero impact on the users. What users need is to know how much they're taking and what it is. And we've certainly seen examples in the States. There's a lot of examples now of ketamine being cut with fentanyl, which is considerably more dangerous than ketamine alone. So knowing what you're taking, either through testing or through having a regulated market, is my view the best way.
David, you mentioned there for drug dealers. I mean, do you think the classification system makes any difference for users who might be facing possession, for example? Are they more likely to use ketamine because it's below, say, cocaine or cannabis in the schedule?
No. The reality is drug users know more about drugs than politicians, and they know that the drug laws don't make any sense.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, David. Finally, in an ever-digital world, have parents become addicted to tracking their children? And what could be the implications of this? Mary Wakefield wrote about why she's changing her mind about snooping on her child. She joins me now, along with Devorah Heitner, author of the book Growing Up in Public, Growing of Age in a Digital World. Mary and Devorah, thank you for joining us on Spectator TV. Mary, you write in the magazine this week about the sort of rise of people tracking each other on their phones, but
yes,
in particular, tracking your children.
Oh, yes.
And you mentioned that whilst you've done this in the past, you maybe now think it's a mistake. So can you tell us a bit about that and and why you think that maybe is.
Yes, I mean, I didn't really think about it too much until I've signed up to Find My Friends. So my husband and some of my family do know where I am, and it's been kind of useful. But the other day I went out without my phone and felt this sort of great sense of euphoria and freedom. And I pinpointed it to not being able to be tracked. My husband can't just text and say, "Oh, I see you're in the supermarket, can you pick up some apples?" And I just realised the luxury and joy of no one knowing where you are. And that made me think, my God, all the, generation that's on Snap Maps and stuff, they don't know that freedom. And my own child, who I'm afraid I do track, he won't know that freedom of never being watched. So that's what I was writing about. That's what I'm worried about.
And as you say, it's not just you. It's a very common thing these days. Do you find?
Yeah, well,
Everyone's
I'm
tracking
Gen
their
X.
kids.
I don't know anything. But as a parent of a 7-year-old, I do find more and more parents are beginning to track their children. And what wasn't normal a few years ago, people, gave trackers a funny look, is now completely routine. Well, where do you put your Apple tag? Oh, I just stick it in their collar. And I've just realised there's something, there's a price to pay. If my mother told me now, "Oh, darling, yes, we tracked you throughout your childhood, and you never knew it," I'd be horrified. So should I be doing the same thing to my kid?
Devorah, what do you make of this? It's something you've written about a lot. I mean, are you pro or anti sort of tracking children?
I think for the most part anti, but certainly I think if we're going to do it, we should be overt and not covert. So they should know if they're being tracked, how they're being tracked, and what's our plan for turning it off. When I talk to parents who are tracking their kids at university and they're not living at home and they're saying, "Oh, are they leaving their housing and going to class?" and they're watching the little dot, that seems very extreme. So working your way back to a 7-year-old, there may be situations where they're riding their bicycle to a new part of town where it does feel like a good idea to see if they got there. And maybe in some ways we can even say it's adding to their freedom because we feel more comfortable letting them take a new independent experience because we can track. But at a certain point, I think that euphoria that you felt being untracked is worth thinking about. And kids need to know that they have the autonomy and the resilience to find their way out of a scrape, find their way home, and that actually a set of skills, including knowing when and how to ask for help in the immediate environment and who is a safe person to ask for help if you need help, is actually more important. Because even if you're tracking your kid, what are you going to do if suddenly their phone turns off? Like, what's your plan? You know what I mean? And how will you manage the anxiety that causes in you as well?
Devorah, you mentioned that. So some parents taking this as far as their children going to university. I mean, do you think that seems absolutely incredible? But do you think that's quite a common thing?
In the United States, it's more common than you might think. And I think in general, parents in other places run a little less anxious. So maybe in the UK, parents are not doing that as much. And people don't tend to, of course, go as far away for university. So maybe there's less anxiety. I don't know how often kids are learning to drive or at what age, but I do think those are the inflection points that we see here in the US. Parents are getting very anxious, and over half of the students in one study at university said their parents are tracking them some of the time. So that was eye-opening for me, because the thing is, if you get used to having that data, when do you turn it off?
Exactly. So, I mean, I understand it with the 7-year-olds, apart from you tell me I have to be honest with my son. But if I said to him, "Darling, this device is tracking you wherever you go," if I was him, I couldn't help just throw it into a trash can or put it on the back of someone else's bike, or just, I mean, the potential for sort of mischief is huge. But yeah, no, most of my teenage godchildren, and even the ones at university, just naturally assume their parents will know where they are. And I do think there's a price to pay for that, not least for the parents, because if you're always looking, and I would be always looking, you're never really letting them go. You're not really letting them develop independence. Even if they don't know it, if you're just sitting there on Find My Friends watching them.
And we're doing it financially too. Like if they're on an app where they're spending money that's shared family money, like then you see where they spent their money too. If they have like Apple Wallet or Google Pay, and that's tied to you. You might not see them on the map, but you know where they just bought a hamburger or whatever.
Do you think it does infantilize them a little bit, doesn't it? If as a parent you're always in that overseeing role, you're not letting them grow up properly.
Yeah. And they may not learn how to make their own plans independently or, again, get themselves out of a difficult situation.
Yeah, it just is a different quality of feeling when you're completely alone and unobserved. You have to rely on your own resources, don't you?
Mary, since you've written this piece, so there has been this sort of the pushback in the office by lots of people here who are sort of tracking their friends and have their parents
There's been some
them.
quite vigorous feeling that it's completely normal and fine, and I'm insane to worry about it.
But the argument
and I
make...
think that the force of their emotion is covering up the fact that they know there's something wrong with it.
They would say, and I actually I find it very weird and a bit creepy, but they would sort of make the case that what's the harm in it? You know, if it puts people at ease knowing where I am, then and, you know, I've got nothing to hide. I go to my work, I go back home, I go to the
You should
shops.
have something to hide. I think if you haven't got something to hide, there's something wrong with you. Have things to hide.
What's your view of the adult side of it, Devorah? Do you think it's fine when adults track each other as well?
I actually think that when we track our kids, we're also teaching them that it's normal to do in adult relationships. And I think we have to question that. Like, if our kids are in a romantic relationship with someone who wants to track them all the time, you know, is that normal, or does that border on abuse? Is that problematic? Like, why does someone need to know where you are all the time? And then what's the next level? The next level is a lot of parents might read their kids' texts. Well, what if your kid's romantic partner wanted to read all their texts? Would you think that was invasive? And I recognize that the parenting relationship is different than a relationship between two equal partners. At the same time, if we normalize all of this invasion of privacy, at what point do kids learn that in any relationship, they might have some rights to privacy, that maybe someone shouldn't be reading all their texts or tracking their location 24/7?
Do you get the sense there's a big generational divide over this still, with sort of, you mentioned this in your piece, Mary, as well, that sort of the older generations are still quite, you know, find this incredibly creepy as we do, or is it sort of taking over everywhere now?
It is definitely something kids and adults are getting more accustomed to. I also talk to a lot of people who are tracking their elderly parents. And I actually think that the case of someone, you know, with like dementia or something who might get lost is a little bit different than tracking your teenager. You know, if you're looking at someone who really is in danger in public places, or who might wander and be confused, again, I think it's something to do carefully. I don't think we should just start tracking our parents just because we're curious, you know, how they're spending their days. But that might be a situation where someone is a risk to themselves, where it might make sense ethically. So, I mean, I think all of these technologies need to be used with intention and thought, and not just, I think it might ease my anxiety to know where my 15-year-old is at every second of every day. You know, did you ever ditch class when you were 15, and did you live to tell the tale?
And learned a lot from it, really, you know. We don't have to be comfortable all the time. We don't have to, you know, medicate our anxiety all the time. I mean, I have sort of friends in their 20s who've been stalked by their ex-boyfriends because they haven't learnt to let go. You split up with someone, and then on Snap Maps they're following them around the place and getting worked up at night about the fact that this person might be seeing someone else. So I think it's horrific to be able to see where all your exes are in the world and who they're with, you know.
You mentioned as well, Mary, that it might be a bit of a false friend in the sense of it might let you let your guard down, that you think you can be rescued at a moment's notice almost. Yeah,
I wonder what Devorah thinks of that. You know, do you get a false sense of security if you're tracked?
Yeah, I do think that it doesn't, if you don't think you have responsibility for keeping track of yourself or finding your way home if you're lost, or figuring out what to do, as I used to when I would go into New York City as a teenager with my friends from the suburbs, and then, you know, sort out what to do. Like, oh, I spent all my money. Now how do I get home? Well, that's a good problem to have, right? Figure it out.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm not going to say it's wonderful to ride back to the suburbs in the toilet of the train, but, you know,
it's a very useful skill to have developed.
Avoiding train bus.
I'm not advocating law breaking on your show exactly, but I am saying that, you know, you want kids to have what I would consider to be sort of mild problems to solve, where the end of the world isn't, you know, nigh when they solve the problem. You know, when I taught my kid to ride the public bus, you know, if he missed our stop, he was just going to end up at the mall, right? That's not a reason to track him. If he ends up at the mall, he'll turn around and get back and get on the other bus. It's not like, oh no, he's going to, you know, end up getting out of the country by mistake without a passport, right? Like, nobody will let that happen. So I think it's really important to look at the actual risks your kids face, whether it's walking or biking or taking the train to school, whether it's deciding that you're not going to track your kid to make sure they're on time. There's also a lot of grade tracking going on, and you can track a lot about how your kid's doing academically. And that might be too much information to have. You know, you do need to see every single quiz, every single homework grade.
Yeah.
I suppose we have quite a safetyist culture, don't we, at the moment, Mary? And, you know, it might well be, we used to let kids outplay much further, for example, and that sort of radius of how far we let children go is just narrowed and narrowed.
Yeah, I'm sure Devorah agrees, yeah. Sorry, go ahead, John.
I was going to say, do you think at some point it will be seen as very irresponsible if you have lost your child and you haven't been tracking them almost?
Yeah, I think it operates on a ratchet system. It's very hard to go back, which is why we've all got to be so careful. You know, it's easy to put all these tracking things on and think safety first, but it's very hard to say, oh, I'll take them off again, because then you think, oh my God, if this is the one time I don't use the Apple tag, and it's the time that something happens, then I'll feel so much more culpable. So proceed with caution.
Yeah, and do you find, Devorah, it's sort of difficult to say to parents, because they could equally come back to you and say, well, you know, if something did happen to them and that was the time I wasn't tracking them and something bad happened, how could I justify that to myself? I mean, what do you say to anyone thinking that?
I think I do understand that, and I live with those anxieties too. And we live in a world where the news media, frankly, you know, overplays some very unlikely dangers and underplays the sort of day-to-day things that skills our kids really need. But I would say whether or not you're tracking your kid, they still need to know how to ask a safe stranger. They still need basic self-defense skills. They still need to be aware of their surroundings, right? And we do a lot to teach our kids stranger danger, but we maybe don't do enough to teach them, wait, how do you talk to the friendly stranger? You know, if you have a kid who can't talk to the children's librarian to ask where a book is, or to the crossing guard, or someone who is a safe adult to get directions from. And we also have to remember, we don't want to teach our kids such a high level of threat assessment that we feel like they need a phone or a tracking device just to ride their bike around the block. Because we do live in a world where most people would help a kid who fell off their bike, right? We don't live in a world where everybody is a terrible person and would harm your child. And so we don't want to teach our kids a disproportionate level of threat.
Yeah, very good point, actually. What are you telling your kid if you put a tracking device in their school bag every day? You're telling them that the world is so unsafe, I need to watch you all the time, you know, which just isn't true.
Brilliant. Thank you, Mary. Thank you, Devorah. That's it for this week. Once again, if you enjoy Spectator TV, do subscribe to our YouTube channel. Just click the subscribe button at the bottom of this video and tap the bell icon so you never miss an episode. Thanks again for watching, and do join us again next week.